Good morning. I'm told I've got 5 minutes, and in the High Court, when you get 5 minutes, they give you an orange light. So I'm a bit nervous, but there's someone here who's going to guide me. Just as Omar introduced me, I run 2 law firms for the Salvos. One's for free, which is kind of like legal aid, in which it practices in criminal law, family and children's law, debt, housing, Centrelink and migration and refugee law. The other one is for fee. So we do property law, business law and commercial law, and all the money we make from that funds the lawyers for that. We've got over 120 lawyers, and we act in now over 260 cases each fortnight. I want to share with you very quickly about the key story in my life that really led me to say, screw it, and I tossed in my commercial partnership and helped set up this practice for the Salvos. In 2006, I was running a little hobby law firm for the Salvos on the side of my commercial practice. A lady came and saw me at one of my offices in Auburn. She'd been out of jail for 6 months. She was in jail for armed robbery, but having come out of jail, she'd tossed in drugs, she'd got her life back on track, she'd gotten a job, she'd reunited with family members who were stable, supportive persons, and she was doing really well for herself. Her name was Beverly. Beverly came and saw me because she was in a spot of trouble because whilst on parole for the armed robbery she'd previously served her time for, and which she was doing really well, there'd been a mistake, there'd been an error. She was out shopping with her 80-year-old grandmother. They were at Best and Less one day out at Parramatta. Whilst taking Grandma around the shop, she had Grandma on her left arm, who was 80 years old. They're walking around collecting tea towels, linen, all sorts of things. She's got Grandma on her left arm and she's putting all the items over her arm here as they walk to the checkout. They get to the checkout counter. They go there. She pulls them off one by one. Pays for about $60 worth of stuff. They go through the checkout, they have a chat, they sit down at the little chair outside Best and Less there. The security guard comes up to her and says, "Excuse me, madam." She stands up. She's still sort of got her hands here and she's got bags everywhere. The security guard says, "Stand up." She stands up. The security guard says, "Please hold out your arms." She holds out her arms and a pair of $7 underwear drops from underneath her armpit here. She's astonished. First thing she says is, "Look, didn't realise it, mistake, come on, let's go back in, I'll pay for it." The security guard looks at her, makes an assessment of her, and says, "No, come with me, come to the back room." Police are called, she's charged, she comes and sees me. $7 worth of underwear threatens to destroy all of the good work she's done. So, being an enthusiastic lawyer at the time, I still am enthusiastic, but time hasn't worn me away that much, but I decide to take this case on to champion it for her. I go out to Parramatta Local Court for her, bring Grandma with me. We're running this case as a not guilty plea on a charge of larceny. Typically, this offence, small fine, but for someone who's on parole, it means she goes back into jail if she's found guilty. We're doing well. She's giving her evidence. The case is going really well. She sits down. I sit down. It's lunchtime. The magistrate says, "All right, we'll come back at 2 o'clock. This lady, she stands up and says, "Your Honour, can I just say one more thing? I'm not guilty, I didn't do it, I would never steal anything." And immediately, for me as a lawyer, I realise that signals to the prosecutor, all right, I can cross-examine her on her criminal record, which is horrible. 2 o'clock comes, we go back in, the prosecutor has a field day with her in cross-examination, she's found guilty. I remember the train ride from Parramatta back to my office in the city there that day, and I felt about this big, thinking all that energy, all that effort, all that hope for this lady has been for nothing. Anyway, the next couple of weeks I put my head down, my bum up, and I work as hard as I can to try to say something persuasive enough to this magistrate to keep this young lady out of jail. I don't know how it happened still to this day, but it did. She was able to stay out of jail. Things were great. I remember being elated at the result. 2 weeks later, her uncle who was in jail, difficult family, her uncle who was in jail was sexually abused. He committed suicide in jail. She was very close with her uncle. 2 days later after that, she committed suicide. I felt awful. You know, this poor lady who was doing so well and finally again had some hope has had it ripped away from her by other circumstances. And I thought to myself, what is the point of my involvement in this lady's life and these circumstances? What's the answer for why I'm here? Over the weeks that followed, I had to endure a very difficult, awful experience of a fight between her mother, who had prostituted her out as a child, who she had never reconciled with, and her partner, who was at the time really messed up in some very hard drugs. We mediated the dispute. The dispute was about whether she should be buried or cremated. It was still to this day one of the most awful disputes I've ever had to be involved with. And again, I thought at the end of that, well, maybe that's why I was involved in this case. Maybe that's why this young lady was brought into my life. Maybe it was to try and bring some closure and to try and have some assisting hand in this whole saga. But it wasn't, because it ultimately led to the young guy who was her partner at the time continuing to call me. He was in a pretty bad spiral of his life, and he kept calling me. He was in trouble with the police one day, he was in trouble with the police another day for another more serious offence, and over the course of about 3 years, I was called on to act for him, and I acted for him for nothing. He wasn't eligible for legal aid, or where he was, he chose not to take it. He didn't trust certain people because of his mental health issues at the time. And I acted for him in a number of serious and not so serious matters. And with the Salvos, one of the big things that we try to help people who are in those situations is to deal with other issues going on in their lives. So for him, it was drug and alcohol rehabilitation. And so I persevered. My deal with him was, I'll do what I can to keep you out of jail if you start to turn these things around in your life. And over a course of about 4 years, that actually happened. Then, after he'd been really good for a while, he'd been abstinent from drugs for about 10 months, he calls me up and says, look, I've been charged with a matter from before when I was in trouble. It was something the police had been holding on to for some time, and had they dealt with it earlier, it wouldn't have threatened to jeopardise his sobriety and wouldn't have threatened to, it was a very serious matter, put him in jail and really ruin his life. Now, in working through this case, I remember going before the magistrate in the local court, and initially she was presented with a guy who was in a very fragile state of his life. He was still in early stages of sobriety. He was just starting to pick up on things. He was still in a situation of conflict with his young child, whose his mother had taken custody of. Anyway, I said to the magistrate, look, let's work with this guy. And she was quite, I wouldn't say frustrated with me, but she was ready to lock him up. She calls in the sheriffs to court. 3 sheriffs come into the courtroom, and to anyone who's been in the courtroom, what that signals is there's only one way out, and that's through the cells. I make an impassioned plea for this young guy, and I say, Your Honour, I'll make a deal with you. Give me 6 months. In 6 months, I'll show he's continuing his sobriety, I'll show he's improving in all these other elements of his life, and if in 6 months you're not satisfied, well then you can take the course that you're choosing to take now. And she said yes. So 6 months later we came back to court. He'd improved. She wasn't yet satisfied that he was ready to continue into the community. And I said to her, you want to give me another 6 months? And she agreed. Anyway, 6 months later we came back to court. So 12 months after the first time, when she was ready to lock him up, we come back to court. And I'm presenting a young guy who's clean of drugs, who's now working, who has done a course and finally commenced a serious level of education for himself that he's going to make something of his life with. He's reconciled with his mother and he's taken an involvement in his young child's life. And I remember this point. After the years of despair that I'd had with his partner and the tragic outcomes that we had with her, this was a young man whose life was very much changed. And the one point that I guess I have is the magistrate realised her purpose in life, or part of it, was to see lives like this transformed. And for me, that's when I realised perhaps there was a little bit more that I could do. And so the stuffed element of what I wanted to share with you is that the system can be changed in a sense if you get upset enough. And so I was pretty upset and tossed in my commercial partnership, and here we are. Now, I've very poorly managed time. It's been waved at me already. And that story was very badly told. Look, if anyone's interested, we send out fortnightly stories of these sorts of clients that we deal with at Salvos Legal Humanitarian. If you're interested, there's our Twitter thing, and I'm happy to join you on that mailing list. So thanks for having me. I'm sorry it was so brief and not very well told, but I hope that to some extent that can give you some insight into what it takes, or what it took in that instance, to get or feel stuffed. All right, thanks.